My name is Dylan, and today I'll be talking about Chapter 17 of the Barron's AP Economics book. In this video, I'll be going over what you need to know for the AP Economics test. So here are some things you need to know. You need to know what fiscal policy is, what a recessionary gap and inflationary gap are, the fiscal policy tools a government has, what a Phillips curve is, what the balanced budget multiplier is, how crowding out works, what the theory of rational expectations is, and lastly, what automatic stabilizers are. Fiscal policy is when the government uses spending and taxes to alter the economy, usually to fight recessions or to counter inflationary periods. The government will fight recessions with tax cuts or giving money to people, or they will choose to increase government spending. The government will try to stop inflation by increasing taxes and reducing spending. During periods of recessions and inflation, the GDP will be different than the GDP at quote-unquote full employment. If the economy is in a recession, the difference in GDP is called the recessionary gap. And if the economy is in a period of high inflation, the difference in GDP is called the inflationary gap. So on this graph here, I'll show how the government actions will affect output. So right now the economy is in a recession. As you can see, the equilibrium point of production is right here, but it's lower than the long run, which means that right now you're producing less than full employment. So the government might choose to increase spending to increase GDP. And so right now, if the government increases spending, it will increase GDP. So this is your new aggregate demand curve. So the AD curve will shift to the right, and now the economy is operating at full employment, with AD, it should be right here, AD intersecting S, the short-run aggregate supply, and the long-run aggregate supply at the same point. Also notice that prices are higher now. This effect is known as the demand pull inflation, when an increase in demand also has an increase in prices. The increases in demand means that people want to buy more of everything, and they're willing to spend more and more money. This will push prices up because suppliers can make more money from the products they are selling. So this next part can be sort of tricky. The AP test will sometimes talk about sticky wages in this question. Sticky wages refer to the idea that wages don't respond to price changes. If the AP test says that wages are sticky, you just answer the question correctly. This means that wages don't respond to price changes, and therefore the input costs don't change. So therefore your short-run aggregate supply won't change. However, the AP test says that wages are non-sticky. There's another shift. If wages aren't sticky, people will demand higher wages because of the higher cost of living. The higher wages mean that the cost of production will increase, and therefore the short-run aggregate supply will decrease. So now if the wages are non-sticky, short-run aggregate supply will change to here. This is your second shift. So now instead of operating here, your economy will operate here. This question can also be worded in terms of the long run versus the short run. In the short run, there isn't enough time for wages to change, and the short run aggregate supply will stay the same. In the long run, wages have time to adjust, and the short run aggregate supply will decrease. So as I said before, government spending will change GDP. This equation shows how government spending will change GDP. Remember the multiplier from last chapter? The multiplier provides a number as to how much the money bounces around between people. We will use the multiplier now to find how much the government money bounces between people and increases their income and their spending. The change in the GDP is equal to the multiplier times the change in spending. This problem is a quick sample problem that the AP test will probably ask you. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9 and the government spending increases by 10 billion, what's the change in GDP? So first off, we need to calculate the multiplier. 1 divided by 1 minus MPC is equal to, so 1 over 1 minus MPC, which is 0.9, which is just, this bottom part is equal to 0.1. So 1 divided by 0.1 is just equal to 10. And now you multiply it by the change in spending, so 10 times 10 billion. And so now you get 100 billion. So notice how the government's only increased spending by 10 billion, but the GDP went up by 100 billion. However, the government can also choose to do a tax cut to increase spending. However, tax cuts provide less of a benefit to GDP because people will actually save a portion of the money cut. So let's say the government's tax says we're going to give you a tax cut of 10 billion. People aren't going to spend that 10 billion. They're going to save a portion of it. So the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9. People are going to save 1 billion and they're only going to spend 9 billion. And so that 10 billion tax cut will actually only turn out to be a 90 billion GDP increase because of the way people will save money. There's a formula here. So the tax cut GDP increase is equal to the tax cut times the marginal propensity to consume. And this will give you how much money they actually spend. And this then you multiply with the multiplier to find out how much the money bounces around between people. So one of the problems with fiscal policies is that it creates budget deficits, or the budget is negative. A tactic the government might use is spending and taxing to recoup the costs and maintain a balanced budget. The spending will increase the GDP and the taxes will decrease the GDP. The effects of spending will outweigh the minuses of taxing, as you saw in the last chapter. Spending is much more powerful than taxing. When the government spends and taxes, the GDP will increase. This will create a balanced budget multiplier of 1. That means if the government spends $1 and it taxes $1, the GDP will increase by $1. The proof of it is pretty simple. You just calculate the GDP increase of spending and the GDP decrease of taxing, and it should turn out that the GDP increase is equal to the dollar spent in tax. I did a short little proof here. So this is the GDP increase from spending, and the bottom is the GDP decrease from taxes, and then when you cancel out, it should equal. So I already simplified it a little bit. This is after I just subtracted the two, and then I factored out some stuff. And if you eventually you get this, and you just cancel out these, and when you factor out correctly, and you should get that the GDP increase is just equal to the money spent and taxed. Pretty simple proof. On an AP test, it's not that difficult. You can just, if you want to, you can just calculate it, but it's much simpler to just remember that the balanced budget multiplier is 1. So the Phillips curve is another graph you need to know for the AP exam. The Phillips curve shows that unemployment and inflation have an inverse short-run relationship. So you can reduce unemployment by increasing inflation, and you can increase unemployment by deflating the economy. However, in the long run, unemployment will be at its natural rate or at full employment, and attempts to change it with inflation are useless, and that's modeled by the long-run curve. So stagflation is a rare occurrence that is impossible on the Phillips curve, and it's a situation with high inflation and high employment, and it's caused when the aggregate supply decreased. The biggest problem with stagflation is that it's impossible to solve it with fiscal policy. Fiscal policy will exacerbate one problem while solving the other. For example, if the government tries to reduce unemployment by increasing aggregate demand, it will end up causing more inflation. If the government tries to solve inflation by reducing AD, it will cause more unemployment. The only real way to fix stagflation is to shift the supply curve right, which is very difficult. So, crowding out is an important thing to know, and it's a negative effect that occurs from the use of fiscal policy to solve recessions. When the government uses its fiscal policy, it needs to borrow money to fund it. So when the government wants to borrow more money, this will increase the demand for loans, as the government is so huge, and it will raise interest rates as a result. The higher interest rates will hurt consumer and spending and business investment, because they will borrow less money and spend less. So in the CIGX model, the G will increase because the government spends more, and C and I will decrease because the consumers and businesses will spend less. This will cause a decrease in aggregate demand, even though the fiscal policy action increases aggregate demand. So as I said before, the need to borrow money will create an increase in demand in the market for what's called loanable funds. Loanable funds are basically all the money that's available for people to borrow. And since the government is so huge, an increase in government spending will increase the demand for money. So this graph right here is a very important graph to know for the AP exam. You need to draw every time a question asks what happens when the government increases spending, because you need to show the effects of crowding out. So this graph is like a regular supply and demand curve with the prices replaced by interest rates. Supply is upsloping because people want to lend more at higher interest rates, and demand is downsloping because people will borrow less at higher interest rates. When the government borrows money, it will shift the demand right. So this is the new demand for money, and notice now the new equilibrium point, it's at a higher interest rate. So this is what happens when the government decides to decides to borrow money to fund its fiscal policy. So the next topic here is another negative effect of fiscal policy. The theory of rational expectations is the idea that people will make the smartest economic decisions that benefit them. The point of the theory is that fiscal policy is not that effective for solving recessions. How it works is that when governments spend more money, they will increase inflation. If businesses and consumers know that prices will increase, they are going to sell and produce less now, and they will produce more later because they can sell at a higher price. So this will actually cause short-run aggregate supply to decrease, causing more inflation and more unemployment. The last topic for this chapter is another fiscal policy tool, but it doesn't really have to deal with spending. It's called automatic stabilizers, which are government policies that again mitigate recessions and slow down expansion periods. They are instantaneous compared to the long deliberate debates required for changes in spending and taxes, and automatic stabilizers will also help moderate business cycles. An example of an automatic stabilizer is income taxes. When the economy is doing well, people will get paid more, and therefore they will have to pay more taxes. This will slow down the economy. When the economy is in a recession, people will make less money, and they will pay less taxes, and this will reduce the effect of the recession. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something from this video.